Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Good. Okay, so this is a lecture about control of respiration. S- Um, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to discuss the control of breathing, the location of the chemoreceptors sensitive to changes in arterial oxygen partial pressure, CO2 partial pressure, pH. Explain the role of chemoreceptors in regulation of the respiration, and lastly, explain all the factors that can alter respiration rate and the depth of respiration. So this is the guideline. What is the lecture is all about? What makes the inspiratory muscle contract and relax rhythmically? How could the respiratory activity can be modified? How could the expiratory muscles can be activated during active expiration? And how could the arterial partial oxygen partial pressure and CO2 partial pressure could be maintained within the narrow limits? And what is the role of respiratory system in regulating hydrogen ion concentration in the blood? To answer all these questions, we need to understand the neural and chemical control of respiration. So, at rest, average respiratory rate is about 12 to 15 breaths per minute, and our blood hemoglobin concentration is about average 15 gram per 100 ml, and each minute our body cells use about 200 ml oxygen, and the oxygen consumption during exercise, especially strenuous exercise, can increase up to 15 to 30 times. Thus, therefore, respiration is directly linked to the level of metabolic activity. So, how the respiration process was regulated? It involves three components, which is sensors, effectors, and central controllers. Which is sensors provided input to the central controllers, and the central controller, which is the respiratory center, will process all the input, all the information, and provide output or instruction to the effectors. Okay, so first we go to all the sensors involved in regulation of respiration, which is the chemoreceptors, pulmonary receptors, and other receptors. So chemoreceptors, which can be divided into central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. So where the pulmonary receptors, which is the pulmonary stretch receptors, which is also called slowly adapting pulmonary stretch receptors, which is responsible for the Herring-Brower reflex. So another receptors is irritant receptors, also called rapidly adapting pulmonary stretch receptors. The third pulmonary receptors is J receptors, or juxtacapillary receptors, and the fourth pulmonary receptors is bronchial C receptors. And other receptors related in respiration is nose and upper airway. Second is joint and muscles. Third, gamma systems. The fourth, atrial baroreceptors. The fifth is pain and temperature. Whereas the center controller, or the respiratory centers, which is the medulla and pons, which is the medulla, have two parts, which is the dorsal respiratory group, which is associated with inspiration, and then ventral respiratory group, shortened VRG, which is associated with active expiration, and the third one is proboscis complex, which is involved in as a pattern generator. And the second parts in the center controller center is a pons, which is have two sub center, which is apneustic center, which has an excitatory function, and pneumotaxic center, which is that one can inhibit inspiration. So as we can see here, this is the controller center or respiratory center. This upper part is the pons, so we can see here the pneumotaxic area and the apneustic center, and the lower part is the medulla oblongata, which is we have the dorsal respiratory group or DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, which is the VRG. So the neural control of respiration involve inspiration followed by expiration. So the rhythm is provided by pre-Bosingna complex or pre-BOTC. So the pre-BOTC or the pre-Bosingna complex is generated by is a network of neurons that involved in generating the breathing rhythm. So we can see here where the position of the pre-Bosingna complex, which is above the DRG, which is in the medulla. So this pre-Bosingna complex become the pacemaker for breathing. Okay, the upper end of the in normal breathing, dorsal respiratory group or inspiratory center generates nerve impulse every 2 seconds. This one will provide the breathing basic rhythm, and the VRG or ventral respiratory group is inactive. And when the DRG firing frequency of DRG increase, the inhalation will be deeper. When the DRG firing a longer duration, the breathing will be prolonged but at a slow rate. And the VRG, the expiratory center, only involved in forced expiration. So, what is the role of pneumotaxic center or PC? PC will be stimulated when the DRG or dorsal respiratory group neuron firing. So they become we call it, this is a negative feedback mechanism. So every time the DRG fired, so every time the DRG fired, then the PC will be stimulated, and the PC will provide will inhibit the inspiration. So the stimulation of the PC will terminate the inspiration. Therefore, without PC, breathing will be the inspiratory will be prolonged, then the expiration will be shortened, or we called it is apneusis. How about apneustic center? Impulse from apneustic center will excite inspiratory area of medulla, or the DRG will excite the DRG. Therefore, this one will prolonged inspiration. Okay, so as a conclusion, the rhythm is generated in medulla but can be modified by the inputs from the pons, which is the pneumotaxic and also the apneustic center. So as you can see here, this is the relation between the pons, the pneumotaxic center and apneustic center, and with the DRG, and also the effectors, which is the intercostal muscles and accessory respiratory muscles and diaphragm. So this is the relationship between the pons, the DRG, and also the effector. So how the breathing pattern or breathing rhythm can be modified. There is a few mechanisms involved in modification of breathing. One of it is reflex modification. There is two types of reflex modification related with breathing, which mechanoreceptor reflex, and also another one is chemoreceptor reflex. So the mechanoreceptor reflex is reflex that activated when there is a changes in the lung volumes. So there is a therefore there is a two types of mechanoreceptor reflex, which is the Herring-Brewer inflation reflex, and the second one is Herring-Brewer deflation reflex. The chemoreceptor reflex is a reflex that activated when there is a changes in the blood gas tension in the blood and also in the cerebrospinal fluid. So there's two chemosensors in the chemoreceptor reflex, which is the peripheral chemoreceptors and central chemoreceptors. Okay, first, now I'm going to talk about the Herring-Brewer reflex. So the inflation reflex, or that happen during forced inhalation. Okay, so when we inhale, we will increase the lung volumes, and the changes in the lung volumes will activate the stretch receptor. So the activation of the stretch receptor will inhibit the inspiratory center, which is the dorsal respiratory group, or the DRG. So the expiratory center was activated by the signal from the stretch receptor. With this, the inhalation process will stop, especially when the lung volumes reaching the maximum and the active expiration will start. Different from deflation reflex, which is happen in when there forced expiration. During forced expiration, the lung volume decrease. So the stretch receptor activated with the decrement in the lung volumes. So the signal from the stretch receptor, the impulse from the stretch receptor will be sent over to the inspiratory center, which is the DRG, and also expiratory center, which is the VRG, through vagus nerve. So the expiratory center will be inhibited, whereas the inspiratory center, the DRG, will be activated. So with this, the expiration will stop, and the inhalation will start. So in the Herring-Brewer reflex, inflection reflex, it will be followed with the expiration, and the Herring-Brewer deflection reflex will be followed with the inspiration activities. So the question is, do this switch off inspiration during the normal respiratory cycle? No, unlikely, because Herring-Brewer reflex only activated, at large volumes, more than 1 liter tidal volumes. So the Herring-Brewer inflation reflex will only be activated at the large volumes, which is more than 1 liter of tidal volumes. So this one will help in preventing overinflation lungs during hard exercise. So next, I'm going to talk about the second mechanism in reflex modification of breathing, the chemoreceptor reflex. There's two types of chemoreceptors, which is the peripheral chemoreceptors and central chemoreceptors. Peripheral chemoreceptors located in the aortic and the carotid bodies, and the central chemoreceptors located in the medulla. The carotid and aortic bodies will detect the changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide as well as oxygen, and also changes in pH. The chemoreceptors in the medulla is sensitive to changes in partial pressure of carbon dioxide and pH. So in normal situation, between oxygen and carbon dioxide gas, the primary, or the one that will activate the chemoreceptor reflex is the carbon dioxide, not the oxygen. This is due to changes in the oxygen partial pressure is not enough to activate the oxygen receptor. The decrement of oxygen in partial pressure oxygen in the artery was not enough to activate the oxygen receptor. Therefore, the ventilation or the breathing will be activated or increased with the increment in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So basically, the main stimulus for peripheral and central chemoreceptors is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and also the hydrogen ion concentration. So now I'm going to talk about the process or the pathway that happen in the central for central chemoreceptors. So as you can see here, the carbon dioxide gas that released in the metabolism will be become as carbonic acid, and then dissociation happen that produce ion, hydrogen ion. So number of hydrogen ion in the blood will increase. So the increment, or when the hydrogen ion in the blood increase, so this one will activate the central chemoreceptors, which is the DRG. So the hydrogen ion will excite the DRG, which is the inspiratory center. When the DRG activated, then the respiration rate will increase. This one will increase the respiration rate. Okay, so why does activation of central chemoreceptors occur when mainly after a rise in peripheral carbon dioxide, but not so much with the peripheral hydrogen ion? This is due to the blood-brain barrier is not permeable to the hydrogen ion. I will explain more with the diagram then in the next slide. Compared to carbon dioxide, which is easily diffused across the blood-brain barrier. So there's two things that will happen in the brain. The first one is carbon dioxide will diffuse into the chemosensitive area in the brain, and the second one is carbon dioxide will diffuse into the cerebral spinal fluid, or the CSF. So when there carbon dioxide in the CSF, the hydrogen ion will be formed, and this one will stimulate the DRG, the dorsal respiratory group, or the inspiratory center. So therefore, increase in carbon dioxide will cause the hydrogen ion in the CSF increase. So as I told you before, the blood-brain barrier, so we can see here the extracellular fluid, which is the brain, and the cerebral spinal fluid, okay, here. So there's a blood vessel here. So basically the blood vessel in the brain cells, there is a barrier, we call it the blood-brain barrier. So the CSF is separated from the blood by the blood-brain barrier, which is relatively impermeable to hydrogen ion and also the carbonic acid. But the CO2, the gas, carbon dioxide, easily diffuse, can go through can pass through the blood-brain barrier. Other than that, is actually the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, contains less protein than the blood. Therefore, the CSF is less buffered than the blood. So we can see the process here. The carbon dioxide in the blood vessel will diffuse. Okay, they will diffuse across the blood-brain barrier. That will activate the chemoreceptor in the ECF, in the blood, in the extracellular fluid. There's an other carbon dioxide gas will be diffused up to entering the CSF. So once the carbon dioxide in the CSF, then the carbon dioxide will form the carbonic acid, and dissociation therefore then producing the hydrogen ion. With the increase in the carbon dioxide gas production will lead to hydrogen ion increase in hydrogen ion in the CSF, and the pH in the CSF will decrease. So before we move to the peripheral chemoreceptors, just want to again I just want to make a point here. The increment in hydrogen ion in the CSF will activate the DRG, or the dorsal respiratory group, which is the inspiratory center, and this one lead to the increase in respiration rate. Now let me talk about the peripheral chemoreceptors. So peripheral chemoreceptors is which is the aortic and the carotid bodies. So both the chemoreceptors here sensitive to partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as pH, and also the perfusion pressure. However, the peripheral chemoreceptors is more sensitive to the partial pressure of oxygen. And then, and you can see here we have the aortic bodies in the aorta, and also we have the carotid bodies here. So the carotid bodies is very high arterial blood flow. Then so this the carotid bodies is very sensitive to the partial pressure of oxygen and also carbon dioxide and pH, but more sensitive to the partial pressure of oxygen. However, it will only produce a significant effect when the partial pressure of oxygen less than 60 millimeter mercury. Then only these carotid bodies will be activated. They will produce impulse to send the signal to the medulla, to the respiratory central respiratory control. So the peripheral chemoreceptors located in the carotid bodies will send signals to the respiration center via the carotid sinus nerve. But the aortic bodies will send signal via vagus nerve to the respiration center. So what happened when there's a changes in the partial pressure of oxygen? So when the less inspired, less oxygen taken in, therefore the alveolar partial pressure oxygen in the alveoli will also decrease. Then the atrial partial pressure oxygen in the atrial will decrease. This one will if the partial pressure of oxygen less than 60 millimeter mercury, then this one will activate the peripheral chemoreceptors, and this will produce reflex via medullary respiratory neurons, and will send signal the respiratory muscles to produce more contractions. So then this one will increase the ventilation rate, and then by having this will lead to cause the alveolar and partial pressure in the artery and alveolar will return to normal. So just want to make a point here. This peripheral chemoreceptors is only have a significant effect when there partial pressure of oxygen less than 60 millimeter mercury. So this diagram is a summary of the reflex modification of breathing, which happens with the three stimulus here. The first stimulus is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood artery. So decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen in the artery will activate the peripheral chemoreceptors. But bear in mind, peripheral chemoreceptor only will produce a significant effect when the partial pressure of oxygen less than 60 millimeter mercury. The second stimulus is the production of non-carbonic acids, such as lactic acid, as in produced with exercise. So the increase in the production of non-carbonic acid will increase concentration, iron hydrogen concentration in the arterial blood. So this one also will activate the peripheral chemoreceptors. The third stimulus is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial. So the increase in the partial pressure carbon dioxide in the artery will increase hydrogen concentration in the arterial blood. So this one also will activate the peripheral chemoreceptors. So the third stimulus only will activate the central chemoreceptors through when the arterial partial pressure carbon dioxide increase. So the partial pressure carbon dioxide in the extracellular fluid of the brain will also increase, and also the increment in partial pressure arterial partial pressure of carbon dioxide also will lead to the increment in the hydrogen ion concentration in the extracellular fluid of the brain. So both the increment in the partial pressure carbon dioxide in the ECF of the brain and the increment in the hydrogen ion concentration in the ECF of the brain will activate the central chemoreceptors. So the activation of the peripheral chemoreceptors and also the central chemoreceptors means more impulse will be produced, so more firing. So the increase in firing, so impulse will be sent to the medulla inspiratory neurons. So the medulla inspiratory neurons will produce more impulse, more signals to send more impulse and signals to the diaphragm and also the inspiratory intercostal muscles. Therefore, this one will increase the contractions of diaphragm and the inspiratory intercostal muscle. Then ventilation rate increase. So generally, respiration rate increase due to stimulus or due to drive. So there's basically generally there's two drive here, hypoxic drive and also hydrogen ion drive. So hypoxic drive is will have an effect via the peripheral chemoreceptors, which is the hypoxic is lack of oxygen concentration. So when there is a drop in the partial pressure of oxygen, then this hypoxic drive will be stimulated, and so normally this one will happen in patients with the chronic CO2 retention, such as in COPD, the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The hypoxic drive also happen in the high altitudes. Okay, so basically the hypoxic drive only happen when the partial pressure of oxygen less than 60 millimeter mercury. Okay, the hydrogen ion drive also have an effect via the peripheral chemoreceptors. The peripheral chemoreceptors play a role in adjusting the acidosis, the blood acidosis caused by the hydrogen ion that increased by the production of non-carbonic acid in the blood, such as lactic acid, or in during exercise, or and patient is like in the diabetic patient with the ketoacidosis. So this hydrogen ion increase in the hydrogen ion concentration will stimulate the peripheral chemoreceptors and cause the hyperventilation, and this one will help in removal of carbon dioxide from the body. So this one will reduce the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. So basically, the hydrogen ion drive is important in acid-base balance. So what happened when decrease in ventilation? So decrease in ventilation will increase the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. So the increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide will increase carbon dioxide in the plasma blood. This this one will activate the chemoreceptors and activate the central chemoreceptors, and the increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide also will increase the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood, therefore lead to decrement in the pH, blood pH. This one will activate the peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic and the carotid bodies. So these both central chemoreceptors in the medulla and peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic and carotid bodies will send the signal impulse to the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata. So this respiratory center will process and transmit the signals, output signals to the spinal cord motor neurons, which lead to the will send signal to respiratory muscles, as intercostal muscles, the diaphragm. So they will increase the rate, the ventilation rate. So other regions of the brain that will affect respiration is brain cortex, which is they can have a voluntary control, such as in onlookers, where the hypoventilation CHS, which is the control hypoventilation syndrome, or that can have due to congenital defect, or that will caused by a trauma or acquired in the later life. So basically, the onlookers is due to loss of the autonomic control of breathing. So second regions of the brain that also will affect respiration is the limbic system and also hypothalamus. This one will be activated with the stimulus from the emotional states. Okay, other stimulus that will affect respiration is receive stimulus from the joint receptors. So impulse produced from the moving limbs will increase breathing rate through reflex modification. So probably this one will contribute to the increased ventilation during exercise. So this diagram is a summary the relations, showing the relation between the receptors and the respiratory center, or the controller, respiratory controller center. So the receptors, the location of the receptors will be in the different organ or system, such as in the lungs, there is a stretch receptors and irritant receptors. So both receptors will inhibit or give signal to the respiratory centers, and there's other receptors also in the muscle and joints that also will send signals to the respiratory centers, and peripheral chemoreceptors, which is located in the carotid bodies and aortic bodies, and the central chemoreceptors located in the medulla. So both peripheral and chemoreceptors will send signals or impulse to the respiratory controller centers, which is located in the medulla and pons. So other receptors, such as pain, emotional states, also will give will activate the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will send signals towards the respiratory control centers in the medulla and pons. So the brain cortex, which is the higher brain centers, also can send signals to the respiratory control centers, especially during the voluntary control breathing, such as breath holding or forced expiration. Now, next we go to a few diseases that related with the respiration. First is a sleep apnea. So sleep apnea, we have two types of sleep apnea. One is obstructive sleep apnea. So this obstructive sleep apnea is a very common and associated with obesity and also sleep deprivation. They and also can be due to impact in cognitive function, whereby the central sleep apnea is due to respiratory depression during sleep, and which is recognized by the absence of the respiratory effort. So this one is considered the central CHS, central hypoventilation syndrome. So giant Stokes breathing is about changes in partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the pulmonary blood, but the changes in the fluid, changes of the carbon dioxide, partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the fluids of the respiratory center delayed. So therefore this delay lead to the chain stroke breathing. So this normally chain stroke breathing occur in patients with the brain damage. So the response to changes in the blood gases is exaggerated. So as a result, changes in the ventilation overcompensate changes on the blood gases. So this is a particular it's not a good sign, and often follows this. Then most of this breathing pattern will be happen in patient with the brain damage. So exercise will follow. During exercise, the ventilation may increase. This is due to a few factors. Basically, first is the reflex modification from the joint and muscle receptors, which will activated during body movement performed during exercise. Second one, due to the increase in the body temperature. As we know, metabolism rate increase with exercise, therefore the heat production will increase and therefore the body temperature will increase. The third factor will be the adrenaline release. When we start to exercise, the sympathetic nervous system will be activated. So the activation of the sympathetic nervous system will increase the release of adrenaline into the blood. So the release of the adrenaline in the blood will also increase the ventilation rate. So the fourth factors that will increase the ventilation during exercise is impulses from their cerebral cortex, which is considered is a voluntary control. So basically, this one also can be the impulse from the cerebral cortex, which is the voluntary control. We can control our ventilation rate. The fifth one later, the other factors that will increase the ventilation when during exercise is accumulation of carbon dioxide in the lead to the increase also the hydrogen ion, beside also the lactic acid production by active muscle. So this one also both lactic production and also the carbon dioxide increment in the blood will increase the iron concentration in the blood. So both of this, the accumulation of carbon dioxide and also the accumulation of the high hydrogen in the blood will also increase the ventilation during exercise. So how the carbon dioxide production during exercise will increase the ventilation rate. So when exercising, when during exercise, the metabolism rate increase, so the production of carbon dioxide will increase in the blood, in the muscles. Therefore, the carbon dioxide muscle pressure in the blood also increase. So carbon dioxide increase in the carbon dioxide in the blood also will increase the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. So other factors that also related to the increment in the hydrogen ion in the blood, related to hydrogen ion concentration in the blood, is the production of non-carbonic acids such as lactic acid that will produce during exercise. So this production of lactic acid in the muscles will also increase the iron hydrogen concentration in the blood. So both of carbon dioxide in production and also the lactic acid production will increase the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. Then the blood pH will decrease. So this the hydrogen ion concentration increase in the hydrogen ion concentration will be detected by the chemoreceptors and the central chemoreceptors, which is in the medulla, as well in the peripheral chemoreceptors will be detected by peripheral chemoreceptors, which is carotid and aortic bodies. So these both of central and peripheral chemoreceptors will send signal and information to the respiratory centers in the brain, so which is in the medulla oblongata. Then the medulla oblongata will process and transmit the correction signal to the effectors, which is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, to contract more. So therefore the respiration the respiration rate will or the ventilation rate increase during exercise. So with the increase in the respiration rate, the carbon dioxide partial pressure carbon dioxide in the blood will decrease.